Hi everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. It's great to see so many people joining us from what looks like Canada, the US, and some friends from Turks and Caicos Islands. Welcome everybody. My name is Nikki Brett, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at the Learning Bar. Over the last 6 months, we've had the pleasure of presenting to you on some topics from early literacy to capacity building and leadership development. This webinar and those that will follow over the next couple of months are designed to provide insight into learning to read and how to support educators during this difficult time. We have a 1-hour slot scheduled for our webinar today for supporting educators to get all children back on track. I am thrilled to have Dr. Wilms present with us on this important topic. He is the founder of the Learning Bar and a renowned researcher with over 40 years of experience in child development. He'll be speaking for about 50 minutes and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. I would encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And then any questions we don't get to, we will be sending out a written response to all of them. Before I hand it over to Doug, I would like to let you know that this is being recorded. And I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory of the First Nations people in our respective locations in Canada, on where we are learning, working, and gathering today. We pay our respects to the members, past and present, and honor with gratitude as they've stewarded the land throughout generations. I'm confident that we will work together in harmony and with the best of intentions. Miigwech. So now I'm delighted to introduce you to Doug Wilms. Doug, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Nikki. And it's a great pleasure to be with all of you on this topic of supporting your educators to get back on track. I'm going to go pretty rapid fire, but just feel free to, as Nikki said, put in questions as we go. I've got a few heretical comments, a few slides in, which it'll give, if your blood's boiling, you can just write them in your comments. So first of all, teachers make a difference. For a long time, I've been doing this longitudinal research and looking at whether it makes more of a difference to be with the right teacher in school or to be at the right school or be in the right school district. And by far, the overwhelming answer is it makes the most difference which teacher. So if you're a parent, you got a child going through the system, it matters more what teacher you have year to year than it does what school you're in and what district. Schools also make a difference, but teachers really make a difference. So I've been looking at some of the literature on why we lose so many teachers, and especially during this time when there's a shortage. We know a lot of districts where there's a shortage of teachers right now, and they're actually worried about setting up in the fall. So most people become teachers because they really want to make a difference. And they want to make a difference in the lives of the children and in their community. And they go enter into the profession with a great deal of optimism. And when they get going, they find great joy when children are learning. But in Canada and the US, about half of all teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. And when you ask teachers why they leave, the most cited reasons are they don't feel adequately prepared through their pre-service training. They don't have support from a mentor, and they find working conditions challenging. And most often it's because of classroom management issues and what they perceive as a lack of support. So those are the things we want to keep an eye on when we think about supporting our educators. I'm going to spend most of this talk talking about literacy and reading, because if I think of kids coming back to school in the fall, some of them have missed a lot of school during the pandemic, but reading is the most fundamental piece to it all. And making what we call a successful transition from learning to read to reading to learn during those primary school years, so most children that happens around age 8 or 9, that's absolutely essential for children's well-being and their trajectories going through school thereafter. When children do not become successful readers, make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn, by age 8 or 9, they quickly become demotivated at school. We see it as early as grade 4, grade 5. They begin engaging in risky behaviors as early as middle school years, alcohol and drug use, gambling, early sexuality, and so on. And certainly we see a rise in poor mental health as well. And it's especially problematic for children who did not learn to read well. And at the end of the day, they're more prone to dropping out of school as well. So the best way to support our educators is by really equipping them with the skills they need so that they can feel that they're really masters in teaching children how to read, that they really know what that's all about. I'm not one for alarming statistics, but I've got to give you this one. Because for several years, I've been involved in the PISA study, several years since 1998, when we first started PISA. The first study was in the year 2000. And year after year, we have about 2/3 of kids are at level 3, level 4, level 5, and 6 in their reading scores. And those students have an opportunity generally to go on to post-secondary in terms of their academic skills. But we have 1/3 of students that are down at level 2 and level 1. And so we're talking at age 15 here, right? So getting ready to leave school, finish high school, and 1/3 still have a very poor reading level down about grade 1, grade 2, and another 20% or so are at level 2. And those level 2, some people say it's around grade 5 level, but when I look at the actual skills involved, it's more like grades 2 to 4. So that's what we've got coming through the system. And sadly, we're stalled. All of the energy that we put into improving literacy skills and so on, Canada's results they've been virtually flat over the last 20 years. I did an analysis for UNESCO looking at how the countries that first started in PISA, there were 28 of them when we first got going, what were their changes in literacy scores over that 20-year period? All of them were virtually flat. Some of them went down a little bit, some of them went up a little bit, but you'll see the numbers there, minus 2.45. If you're familiar with effect sizes, that's just an effect size of 0.02, 0.024, or going up by 0.022 a year. Very, very small effects. You can just basically say we're stalled. We haven't improved hardly at all. Well, I just want to show you a couple of statistics based on a number of studies that we've done internally and a few things that we've published in print. First of all, when children enter kindergarten, they vary markedly in their cognitive and language skills when they start kindergarten. And we found that there's a 4-year age range. So what do I mean by that? So let's just take children, when they enter kindergarten, they're 4 years, 8 months to say 5 years, 7 months old. But let's just say for a 5-year-old. So we got some 5-year-olds who have skills of a 5-year-old. Most of them do. But we've got some 5-year-olds who even have skills of a 6-year-old, not so many. But we've got a lot of kids who have skills of a 4-year-old and even skills of a 3-year-old. So they're all age 5, but there's a 4-year age range there. The other fact that we've been, looking at, and we now have a large amount of data from our early years evaluation where we can really address this, that I call it the 50-20 rule. If you go into most school districts, we find that about 50% of the kids who are vulnerable, so let's say with what we call tier 2 and tier 3 learning needs, if you think of a response to intervention framework, 50% are in about 20% of the schools. So this is a very old map, but it tells a story well. So ones in red there, they're students who have tier 3. So back on the previous slide, those would be kids who are probably, unless things change for them, they're prone to being at level 1 when they get to be age 15. And then we've got some here at tier 2 needs, and they're the ones who are prone to be at level 2, maybe 3 by the time they reach age 15. And then the green ones in green there are kids who are doing fine. So if you look at this district, you've got this concentration of students. how many? About 20% of the school, about 20% of the schools in this district would have kids who are vulnerable. So I always think about a teacher waking up here, two teachers waking up, say, in this area, and they're both going off. One's going up here to this school where more than half of the kids are vulnerable, and the other teacher is going down here, say, to this school here where very few kids are vulnerable. Well, they got different teaching jobs altogether. They got different job descriptions as far as I'm concerned. Hugely different, hugely more challenging to work in one of those schools. So I promised you a few heretical statements, and feel free to put your comments in the chat group if you like. We need to change our approach to teaching reading during the primary years. If we just keep doing what we're doing, we're just going to be another flat profile for another 20 years. So some things that we've learned so far. First of all, the 3 cueing approach, or some might have called it the sight word approach, and the balanced literacy doesn't work. We know that systematic phonics does work. Teaching children in 4 or 5 small groups where the teacher is just working with one group and the other kids are all working independently, maybe with support from an EA, from an educational assistant, that doesn't work as well. What you need is structured teaching. I saw an article recently called what John Hattie and Marzano both agree on. And they both agree on that structured teaching is the thing. You've got to get teachers doing structured teaching. And I'll show you soon what that means. Grouping children by ability is ineffective. But I can still remember back when I was in kindergarten, grade 1, that the common thing was 3 groups. You had the bluebirds and the robins and the buzzers. Not really, didn't call us buzzers. Anyway, 3 groups, and kids knew which group they were in. That's ineffective. And there's been lots of studies now showing that ability grouping is ineffective. Teaching children in small groups following the principles of cooperative learning is effective. And I'll talk about that soon as well. So the second 3 heretical statements, if you will, is that we need to change our approach to addressing the needs of vulnerable students. And so some things we've learned so far. Response to intervention, it's being used widely across Canada, across the United States and elsewhere, but it's not an intervention itself. There's people saying, well, here's what you should do with children who have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, but it's not an intervention itself. So using RTI isn't necessarily effective. There's just been a very large study in the States covering, I think, 15 different states looking at RTI. And overall, the effects of states who are using RTI, the results were negative compared with states who are not using it. So you have to just think of it as it's a management system to say which kids need an intervention, need extra support, and so on. Reading recovery is a failed investment. There's some big reports out of both New Zealand, a paper by Jennifer Buckingham, saying reading recovery is a failed investment. If you look at some of the individual studies about reading recovery, oh yes, you can get fairly good effects if you have a very intensive intervention with just a small, teacher trained in reading recovery, working with 1 or 2 students, you get big effects. But system-wide, it's way expensive. And I'll just go back to those results I said earlier. 1/3 of kids are not learning to read well. You just can't have that many reading recovery teachers, let alone that many special ed teachers. And then the third statement is all teachers can acquire the core skills of special ed teachers. I've been looking lately at what is the actual training of special ed teachers? What's special about special ed? And when I look at the training programs, both in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, they all advocate the same strategies that we're trying to, when we talk about building capacity in the schools, building capacity among teachers, they're the same skills that we want regular classroom teachers to have. So in my view, we can get all teachers learning those skills. There's nothing magic about it. And the more that we build up that capacity, great. Now, there's still going to be a role for special ed teachers, but that's probably going to be for those kids who have much more severe problems. I won't use the term, well, people use the term dyslexia, but a lot of those children, that bottom 8 or 10%, often those kids are dyslexic, but there's also kids with intellectual disabilities and other kinds of disabilities. So what does work? This is kind of an outline of the rest of my talk. I'm going to talk about 5 elements of an effective intervention. The content, what we really need to be taught. So when we're talking about supporting our teachers, what is it they need to know? What is it they need to teach? The instructional approach, how is it taught? And for me, it's really a dual, there's the science of reading, and there's lots of material out there, and then there's also the science of teaching and the science of assessment. It's the way this material is taught is probably equally important as the actual content. And then if we frame it as an intervention, how long does it take? How many hours per day? For how long? The intensity, which should be the group size, and then the fidelity of implementation, which means, is the program implemented as intended? So there's a lot of different interventions out here. So if you're looking at an intervention, it's not all about the books and the materials and so on. Really look at the process of what's going on. As I go through, I can't help but talk about our program called Confident Learners, because we're engaged with it with a number of school districts and schools across the country, working in a lot of Indigenous communities. And so it's really something that is near and dear to me. And we're really excited about some of the progress we're making. So I have to bring in some examples from Confident Learners as they go along. But I'm going to try to keep it a little pure to what you can do as superintendents, principals, and teachers. So Confident Learners is an initiative that brings to bear the science of learning how to read, a rigorous curriculum aligned with teaching activities and assessments, quality professional development, and the support of communities and families to ensure that children become fluent readers. So the goal is really fixed on becoming fluent readers. Okay, so let's get started on content. What is it that needs to be taught? 20 years ago, there was a very influential report from the new U.S. National Reading Panel which called for instruction in 5 domains, and these are often referred to as the Big 5. Phonemic awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics instruction, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. I'll be covering each of those. But I also want to say that following that report, there was a big report in the United Kingdom called the Rose Review, 2006. Another report in New Zealand, 2013, said why the New Zealand literacy strategy has failed. Another one in Australia by Castles, Rastel, and Nation called Ending the Reading Wars. That was in 2018. And now in 2022, in Canada, we have the Ontario Commission report called The Right to Read. So this call for a change in how we're approaching reading has been going on for a long time. And yet over those 2 decades, results haven't changed. Didn't change in Canada, they didn't change in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and so on. And in fact, across all of the OECD, which are the more wealthy countries, they've been virtually unchanged over that 20-year period. So 3 phases of learning to read. This approach that I'm taking has been heavily influenced by an important paper by Castles, Rastel, and Nation called Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert. This diagram is not there, this is mine, but this is the way I've conceived it, because I want to say that there's boundaries between them, but they're not really as well defined as one might think. And also, of course, when someone's learning to read, becoming a reader, they're also becoming skilled and they're also becoming an expert reader. They're learning to read while they're reading to learn. They're reading to learn while they're learning to read. But this first phase is really key, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So, you can go through a course on the science of reading, and you'll hear all about phonemic awareness and phonological awareness and phonics instruction, reading comprehension, all those good things, and yet it really doesn't give a teacher something to grab hold of to say, how do I operationalize that in the classroom? So that's really what we're about, is we're trying to say, here's how we can go about it. So when I talk about each of these three phases, I'm all about scope and sequence. Scope is saying, what are the skills and the topics and the concepts that need to be taught, and what is the sequence? There was a paper done by a reading researcher named Paris, who used the term constrained knowledge. And I really like that idea. If you think about, say, chemistry, there's a set of facts that you need to know, like the periodic table. There's some concepts that you need to know, that here's how certain elements combine and so on. And those must be mastered before students can make much progress in higher order skills. Similarly with reading, there's this constrained knowledge that one needs to know before you can move from one phase to the next. We'll see soon that that constrained knowledge is much more easily defined for phase one than it is for phase two. And phase three, it's really unconstrained. Phase three is about reading comprehension and, and becoming an expert reader. That's a lifelong journey, just like having strong vocabulary skills or anything else. But what we do is we develop some strategies to constrain the knowledge for each of those phases. And I'll talk about those. And then sequence. Sequence is important. And teachers will say, well, which letters should you teach first? Or if you're looking at the connection between letters and sounds, or the other way around, sounds and letters, which of those connections should we teach first? That's a common question. But also at a more macro level, which things should you teach first? Should you talk, really focus on those letter sound relationships, and if so, which ones, and so on. And then also we use this term efficiency. By efficiency, those of you who know the Dolch list of 220 words, it was a great idea that Dolch had in 1936, I think it is. And he said, if kids get to know these 220 words by sight, then they'll know half of the words that are in most of the basal readers of that era, but teachers still use those today. We use them as well. They're still a great way. And it's efficient. So it's efficient if you're going to teach some kids irregular words, that is words that you can't sound out easily, that's a good place to start. And then finally, motivation. One of the criticisms of a phonics-based approach or systematic phonics is that they say it's boring, that kids lose interest because they're getting sound after sound after sound, and they're not actually doing any real reading. So we really try to interleave what's happening day to day with one kind of objective with another kind of objective. And so we're really about the motivation piece is hugely important. There's a very good paper from the National Academies of Sciences, and we don't have it at my finger, sciences and medicine, so on. Unfortunately, education is not in the list, but it's called How People Learn. And they talk about three aspects of motivation: self-efficacy, which I say, I have a shorthand, I can do it. Values, that you value what you're learning, I want to do it, and you're interested in learning. I will like doing it. So I can do it, I want to do it, and I like doing it. So all the time that we're trying to build up an intervention, we would keep our eye on the motivation piece. So here we go. Phase one, becoming a reader. So reading is a cognitive process that involves decoding symbols to obtain meaning from text. Phase one is really all about decoding, getting kids able to sound out words. So knowing the sounds of our language and knowing how they're connected to what they see in print. And there can be kind of an aha moment called the alphabet principle when kids say, oh yeah, that sound is represented in print this way. So decoding is the ability to translate a word in print to its pronunciation. At the same time that's going on, they have to have meaning. So obtaining meaning from the text entails forming connections with the meaning of words that children have stored in their memory. Now, we take kind of a hard line here. You'll have heard about the simple view of reading, that you have to have language going in tandem with the decoding process. We say, no, just focus on decoding during phase one. That other thing will happen later. Why? Because kids come to school with a lot of words, and they're even kids from relatively poor backgrounds, they'll still have 2,000 words or so when they arrive at school. And then what's really amazing is how fast kids develop their vocabulary without any real intervention. So our view is, let's get the decoding down first, and then we'll focus on the language later. Why? Because you've only got so much time in the day. So the scope then, we've set out a scope, we've narrowed it down to 8 core skills associated with becoming a reader. I won't read them out to you, but you'll see, starting with really, which is a pre-kindergarten skill often considered, or a kindergarten skill at least, understanding the basic concepts about print, and then getting to know their letters, 26 lowercase, uppercase letters, and then getting to know the sounds of the language, the 44 phonemes, but also getting to know them quickly. So when they hear them, they can say them, recognize them, make those connections quickly. That leads to being able to decode words. At the same time, we want them to get on with learning some high frequency words, and that leads to reading short sentences and reading some passages. So this is what our program called Confident Learners looks like. I won't go into the details, but you'll just see that a lot of things are all happening simultaneously. And to give you an example, when they get their first learning their alphabet, but then when we focus on the first 5 sounds, with just 5 sounds, they can already decode 8 different words. And so get them to decode those 8 words, and their VC vowel consonant or consonant vowel consonant words, they can already start printing some words and spelling them. That's what the encoding means, spelling words. And you can also pick up a few irregular words. It's nice to introduce the word I at the beginning, or a few other irregular words, so they can write some simple sentences like I can run, or whatever. And we also like to give them a few fun words that's aligned with their interests. Remember, that's that part of motivation. So they, if kids are into dinosaurs, give them a fancy word like brontosaurus or dinosaur. And then I can run, the dinosaur can run, and so on. And so they're already, right from the get-go, they're decoding words, encoding them, learning a few irregular words, and starting to write some sentences. So that's phase 1, heavy focus on decoding. Phase 2, becoming a skilled reader. So the primary learning objective of phase 2 is being able to recognize several words by sight. And so the deal here is that they still are decoding some words in the same way as in phase 1, but their repertoire of words that they can sound out is increased. So there's that much more direct path from seeing the word in print to its meaning. And while they're doing, so we're doing that, we're also building up the number of those relationships, these phoneme-grapheme relationships as we go along. But the main idea here is this path starts fading. That's why it's in pink instead of bright red. And you've got orthographic learning going on. So orthographic learning is really about this skill called morphology, the form and structure of words. And at this level, it's just really learning a small number of prefixes and a small number of suffixes, and being able to see how they change the meaning of words. And also the etymology of words, which is the origin and historical development of words. So that some reading specialists say that's not so critical. Others say they're all about it. I just say there's some kids, and especially some of the kids who are not struggling with decoding at this point becoming word detectives and saying, oh, where did that word come from? Is it a Greek origin or a Latin origin, and so on. So we delimit the scope. Remember I said you have to delimit the scope somehow. We do it by looking at the frequency of certain words or graphemes and grapheme-phoneme relationships and the age of acquisition of words. So we have a corpus of some 30,000 words that are all lined up by age when kids learn a certain word, like mama is actually comes before dadas, sorry dads. And as you go along, that's like an age 2 word. Birthday, even though it's a big word, is learned very early. And then other words, say the word acquisition, it's probably got an age of acquisition of, I don't know, 12 or 13. The word grapheme might not, it'll be on the list, but it'll be way up there. So we know what words are really common in the speech of children from age 1.5 right through to age 8 or 9. And so when we look at trying to define the scope of these skills, we use the AOA. And let's focus on those words first. So I'll just give you a little example here. So I've been throwing out these terms. If you're not entrenched in this work, these words phonemes and graphemes are they're bread and butter for reading specialists. But so phonemes are the sounds we hear in words, and the sounds are then represented in print with graphemes. So for example, there's the short A, the ah sound, and 96% of the time that ah sound is like the ah in hat. But every so often, a small percentage of time, that ah sound is represented with AI in print, like in the word plaid. Still the same sound, hat, plaid, but represented a different way. And then the AU in laugh is another one. All right. So B, 97% of the time, B is in big, but every once in a while, B is in rubber, double B, like in the word rubber. But for those two phonemes, we're just concerned with getting them to learn those. Now look at F though. F has only 78% of the time it's pronounced like in fun, sometimes like giraffe, sometimes like a PH, it appears as a PH like in the word phone. I don't know why that is, but that's for those people who want to look at the etymology of words. You can figure out why we ended up with PH. So what we do is we take that corpus of words and we look at the words in everyday speech based on their age of acquisition. And we say, how many times does that double F appear? And it appears quite a few times. So we're going to keep that one when we go on to phase 2. And we're going to use the PH as in phone. Probably don't worry about the LF as in half and the GH as in laugh. They'll pick that up as they go when they start to see words. But doing the explicit teaching, we can limit it down to about 20 new phoneme-grapheme relationships. And that's efficient because just like the idea of Dolch, we've got a way to say, okay, now they can decode and recognize, like 98% of the words just with that. So the sequence of these 3 types of skills, the grapheme-phoneme relationships, the prefixes and suffixes, and the origin words, again, we base the sequence on their age of acquisition and also with attention to making that interleaving those skills. So they're not just going grapheme, grapheme, grapheme one day and then something else the next. They're interleaving, quite often addressed within the same kind of lesson. Phase 3, becoming an expert reader. So now kids aren't sounding out words. Most of them they're recognizing right away. They've practiced sounding them out. And after they've sounded out a word about 5 or 6 times, what the literature suggests, then that becomes part of their sight vocabulary. They don't have to sound it out. But every so often they'll encounter a new word and they've got the decoding skills to sound it out and they'll be able to know what the meaning is. So this process, phase 3, is all about reading comprehension. is the ability to understand the meaning of written text. And we know that that meaning is related to their prior knowledge, their reading processes, and their cognitive resources. So that's what we're about with phase 3. And when we talk about this process, we're saying that it's achieved by interacting with the text. So it isn't just like you're reading it. There's an actual interaction. If you think of yourself reading a novel, you get really immersed in it, and what you're interacting with the text. Reading comprehension in most curricula, Ontario curricula, or the Common Core, the US Common Core curricula, they usually, and the big reading tests, they usually distinguish between literary text, poems and stories and the like, and more technical text. So here we have Maritza, as an example, building an airplane. And it's her first one, and it's pretty complicated for her. It's got a lot of parts, and she can see from the picture on the box what it's supposed to look like, and she decides, though, to follow the instructions included in the box. So she's reading text, and she's reading it very deliberately, and she's interacting with the text. Now, she has some prior knowledge about airplanes. She knows what a fuselage is, for example, but all of a sudden it says, glue the cowl over the motor unit. How does she, what is that? So that's something that maybe just model airplane enthusiasts would know about. But when Maritza's motivated, she really wants to do this, and the instructions are challenging for her. And so she has some strategies that she can adopt. So just when she's on the verge of giving up, she draws on some of those strategies. She reads the instructions again. And you know, if you've ever put together one of these desks that come in a box, I won't give you any brand names, but you know what I mean. You probably read through the instructions 2 or 3 times. So she looks at the picture on the box, she reads the instruction again, she pays more attention to the figures that label the parts, and finally she makes some inference about what the instructions mean. And then just before gluing it together, she evaluates her progress. That's part of reading comprehension. She looks at the emerging model and reads some of the instructions again, looks at which ones are coming next. So the scope for phase 3, these are not clear in the literature. And if you look at the Common Core state standards in the US or any other curriculum standards, they kind of fizzle out after grade 1, grade 2, and they just say the child is able to read grade level text with comprehension. That's all they say. But what does it really mean? It means explaining the meaning of words. So word knowledge, you're still building up your word knowledge at that age. Remember that age of acquisition? We only talked about up to age 8, but it keeps going, understanding the meaning of words. But you're also developing a skill to retrieve information from text, interpret and integrate that information, and then make inferences. And I learned long ago in working with large-scale assessments, with PEARLS, for example, the Program of International Reading Literacy Assessment, or with PISA, there's this little moniker I call it, identify, interpret, infer. And so that's the way I think about this, is you're trying to identify some pieces of information, you're trying to interpret them, what they mean, and make some inference. As a matter of fact, I'll just say a little bit about numeracy here, that children can't go much beyond grade 3 in their math skills unless they can read well. Why? Because word problems come to the fore around, well, even in grade 2, grade 3. And so they can't do word problems unless they can read well. But not only that, the skills are actually the same when they read one of these word problems. They have to identify the relevant pieces of information they went to the store and they bought 10 of this type of candy and 12 of that. So there's some relevant information. They've got to interpret that information, and then they've got to make an inference about it. So it's the same set of skills. So, and we don't teach kids those skills. That's just, to me, seems so fundamental. Not only that, if you look at any of your large-scale assessments, if you looked at the kind of provincial or state assessments that are used, they've all got that 3-piece embedded into it. And then we've got the sequence. How do we develop the sequence? And so there's a boundary between phase 2 and phase 3. And the best way I could describe it is you're no longer focused on phoneme-grapheme relationships or working with suffixes and prefixes and so on. You're actually what is called in the civil view of reading called linguistic comprehension. And that requires a whole new set of skills. Kids learn how to parse sentences, learning how to interpret the meaning from larger context, make inferences, and they're learning about parts of speech, the rules of grammar. So we've got a nice little activity that I'm kind of proud of called the word train. It starts out with just an article and a noun and a verb, and then we can add on adjectives and adverbs, so the train gets longer as they go along. But those are the kind of skills that kids can really engage in once they can decode and once they've developed a few more of those grapheme phoneme relationships, learn about suffixes and so on. So sequence, we developed a sequence for phase 3 in the same way as we use the age of acquisition. We use the level of words in children's typical vocabulary, and we try to interleave them. So we've got a lot of things happening at once. In international assessments and in state assessments, provincial assessments, and even our own assessments, a typical process is to have a child read a passage and answer some comprehension questions. So here's our easiest one. It's called Olivia Loves Ovals. I'll leave it to you to read it on your own. I'll try to talk slowly here. But so here's Olivia Loves Ovals. You've got a bike with oval wheels and so on. And so 3 comprehension questions. What is Olivia's favorite shape? Why could Olivia not ride very fast? So that's identify. Why couldn't she ride very fast with her new bike? That's interpret. And then why did Olivia thank her sister? So that would be an inference question. And when we look at a passage, we're not just using you might be familiar with the Flesch-Kincaid reading level. Flesch-Kincaid reading level, it just has 2 parts to it. The length of the sentences. So a short sentence brings the level down. And it's also how many 2 and 3 syllable words, well, 2 or more syllable words. So this one, having the word bedroom in there would drive up the Flesch-Kincaid and so on. So we're not looking just at that, but we also want to know how many decodable words are there and how many high frequency Dolch words are there? How many irregular words that can't be sounded out are there that are not part of their Dolch sight vocabulary? And then how many AOA words, age of acquisition words, in this case above age 5, because this is meant to be a really easy one. So there's only one word there, and it turns out to be oval. It's an AOA word that kids would not normally acquire until age 6 or 7. So that's how we go. And the idea here is you just keep getting more and more difficult passages. And as you're building passages, you're making passages that bring in some of those particular skills that you're wanting to reinforce. Maybe it is new suffixes or prefixes. It could be new grammar concepts. But that's the way it rolls. Is you're always working with passages because kids are reading, and reading comprehension is the goal here. So that's the content. I'm running out of time. I'm going to go really quickly here. How is the content taught? First of all, teachers need to become familiar with the science of reading. They may have got enough of it during their pre-service training, but quite often not. And certainly the science has changed for those teachers who are new. There's a whole science of teaching. We have developed a set of international standards based on the standards that are expected of good teaching in 5 different countries. And so we rely on those standards, and then finding the science of assessment. So we have a learning management system where you go on and you'll see, I better use the science of reading, science of assessment, science of teaching. And So we can get them engaged in that. The science of both, well, all three of them really, you can get the knowledge pretty quickly. They can motor through the courses, but it's really, a good solid year-long process or even a 2-year process to get through to really practice the skills. So science of reading, knowing the skills at each phase, the sequence, and so on. Science of teaching, knowing how children learn, understanding how ways of learning differ with context. And then classroom strategies, we really spent a lot of time talking about that. Remember my thing, how you support educators, the third reason why a lot of teachers leave the profession, classroom management. It's really something that is most challenging for a lot of teachers. And then emphasizing high yield teaching strategies. Really good literature out there now. There's been so many meta-analyses. There's the book by John Hattie that I'm sure you've heard about, Visible Learning, talks about high yield teaching strategies and so on. Science of assessment, different types of assessment. And then we're talking about becoming a reader. So this is phase 1. So we have a systematic phonics program that integrates principles in teachers' professional learning with a research-based literacy program. So I'm very keen on looking at effect sizes. Effect sizes aren't the be-all and the end-all, but they do provide some guide as to what works and what doesn't work. And you'll see cooperative learning way up there, using structured lessons, systematic phonics instruction with effect sizes all above 0.5, whereas whole language, which would be the 3 cueing system, very, very small effects. And then you even see grade retention, failing kids with a negative effect. So when we work with a school, we want all teachers to be engaged, say kindergarten right through to grade 3, sometimes it's grade 5. First thing is getting to do a structured lesson. Structured lesson has 6 parts, sometimes called direct instruction. The first 3 pieces there are very fast. They can be done like in 5 minutes or less. Set a visible and challenging goal. What are we going to learn? Activate prior knowledge, and then model the skills. And then let's try it. Guiding learning. That's the bulk of the lesson right there. And that's where kids can go into small groups. And we're really aficionados of cooperative learning. And so that's where you have that small group work. And then they can either come back from their groups or even stay in their groups and check for understanding. And that's where a lot of your formative assessment happens. Well, it can happen in here. It's actually formative assessments happening in too while they're working in groups. But you can have a couple of really nice, crystal clear form of assessments that will enable you to say, yes, I know this guy's got it and this guy doesn't have it, and so on. And then giving, let's do more, independent practice, things that they'll do at home or the playground, whatever. As I said, we're big supporters of confident learners. And I won't, cooperative learning and confident learners, but cooperative learning. It's just a very well laid out. There's very strong literature showing its effect, and getting teachers to be really good at cooperative learning, knowing these 5 core elements is really key. So I won't go into this in detail, but this is what our program looks like. So I said it's systematic, and there's a sequence. So there's a sequence in which we introduce the phonemes, and as they're moving through the course of a school year, there you see the structured lesson. We've also got spaced learning, cooperative learning, and these are more of the reading strategies. So we want teachers initially to become really, really good at doing a structured lesson and knowing how to do a good read aloud. All teachers do a read aloud, but there's a process there that it's really about becoming a good storyteller, in my view. And so each of the modules are structured in a particular way. And then we have a assessment. It's called the Phonics Advantage Reading Assessment. It has 25 challenges, following again that sequence, that scope and sequence that we set out. And I already like this. here. Yeah.
Sorry, Doug. I just want to
understand.
give you, yeah, I just want to give you the heads up. It's 1:50, and if we would like to have some time for Q&A, it
Okay.
would be, yeah.
All right.
Great to include
Let me
it.
just say about this one, and then I'll go very fast, 2 minutes. So what I like about this is teachers can see how well kids are progressing, looking laterally, but then they can also look vertically and say, oh, gee, some kids here still don't know their letters. And you can pour over this slide later. We're going to send out the slides, but love that one. Next thing, how long? We really advocate initially 2 50-minute blocks on phase 1 skills. Sounds like a lot, but there's the time. And if you can get them decoding early, they're going to make really fast progress. It's a 3-year commitment. We know from the literature that it takes 3 years to really turn around the school and see some dramatic changes in student performance. And so 2 50-minute blocks and so on. What's the group size? We're all about inclusive classrooms. It's only a small number of kids that need to be sent out of the class for specialized instruction. Fidelity of implementation. So that means, is the program being implemented as intended? One of the lessons that we've learned is that principal leadership is all important. If you haven't got that, it's very hard to get change. Why? Because it's the principal that's going to keep people on track. We have a very good, 2 very good leaders in this, Karen Power, one of the authors of this book, Leading with Intention, and Neil Dabowski, who are really experts, had lots of experience as principal and superintendent to bring about leadership, change in leadership. I won't get into this very busy graph, but we have a framework for accountability to say, here's what happens. But it's all about bringing data, regular assessment, and so on. And I have to show this graph because we're looking at some of the results from a number of our districts. And even though it was a year of, we still had a lot of kids out of school. So we got, at the beginning of the year, 93% were at emerging level. What did that mean? They didn't necessarily know their alphabet, upper and lowercase letters, and had trouble sounding out even the basic phonemes. There are 23 basic phonemes. F as a F sound, B as a B sound, and so on, and being able to decode words. 4 months later, we've got a number of those kids gone from 93 to 78. So you do the math there, what 15% have moved up into this level. And so some of them are at the bronze level and on and on. And what we're finding is that when kids reach the silver level, they really motor through. And this went from 0.5, 0.5% to now 7% of the kids are at that level. So I say it's a 3-year commitment. And I'm going to just, oops. Sorry, I was got 2 screens going. So thank you very much. And we have 7 minutes for questions, but I'm happy to stay longer.
We have 5 minutes for questions, so we have got a couple of questions coming in. Well, I don't think we're going to get through them all, but I'm going to start with the first one. So if you're just sending some questions in, just bear with me. So the first one from Diane, I think this refers to one of the earlier slides. Doug mentioned about don't teach in small groups, but then right after that it said teach in small groups.
Yeah. So what I mean is, I was a bit reluctant to use this term daily 5, but the daily 5 has teachers working with one group of kids, and then the other groups are all working independently, but without any kind of instruction, as opposed to small groups designed for cooperative learning, where kids are very strategically matched. So it's about matching the kids, and they've got things that they can work. They've got activities they can work on independently, but the teachers walking around and working with each group as they go. It's really a difference between having kids cycle through, and I've seen another program in Australia, the same idea where they called it the engine room. So the teacher would call 3 kids to the engine room and everybody else was just on their own. They had an educational assistant working with them, but that was that. So cooperative learning, it's really about having really fun and engaging activities designed closely to learning objectives, and the teachers then monitoring that as a whole class.
Okay, thanks, Doug. We might have just a chance for one more question. In the stats regarding the percentage of children not reading at grade level, how are the stats for children with learning disabilities, dyslexia in brackets, and intellectual disability incorporated into the interpretation of that data? I.e., it's estimated that 15 to 20% of children may have underlying dyslexia per recent research. Interested in your comments on that. Sorry, that was, I should have done a small one, sorry.
Yeah, so I got a couple of comments. You know, if you look at the US IDEA, the way the classification of kids with children with disabilities, they don't have dyslexia in, but certainly it's in the psychological manual. So the first thing about dyslexia is it's only about 8 to 10% of kids, and there's different types of dyslexia. It's not a really uniform group. There's some kids have specific problems with decoding. There's other kids have problems with meaning of words and so on. So it's a and a lot of those overlap. Some kids have all those problems. So those kids are part of that. So in the PISA study and PEARLS, students with intellectual disabilities, they tend to not. They tend to be held back from doing this thing as well. So there may be, those stats may even be more than what I've suggested of 33%, because there's a certain number of kids don't do the exam at all. When you talk about children with learning disabilities, there too, aside from dyslexia, there's quite a wide range of how that's defined and so on. And that we go into great lengths about that because it's, again, it's quite a varied group and of varying degrees as well, right? So, but a lot of those kids with learning disabilities, they can learn to read. Now that's the message here. They can learn to read with the right kinds of support. We're all about supporting our educators. If teachers are using a systematic phonics approach, most of them can read, and so that's the core message here.
Okay, maybe time for one more, but it's got to be a short one.
Okay.
For struggling readers in grades 6 to 9, what might you suggest to support their reading abilities?
In grade 6 or grade 9?
Yes, grade 6 to 9.
Yeah, so
No,
yeah, and we run into them all the time. And that graph that I showed you with how many kids were down at the emerging level, those were in a lot of schools covering grades 1, kindergarten to grade 3. So we do certainly see kids grade 6 to 9. So here's the challenge. First of all, were they taught with a 3 cueing system? And if they were, quite often that didn't work for them. That 3 cueing system works for a lot of kids. Somehow by osmosis, they learn how to sound out words. But a lot of kids in that 1/3 were taught with 3 cueing systems. If that's the case, I would still recommend systematic phonics. They need to learn those phoneme-grapheme relationships, learn how to sound out words and so on. Exactly what I was talking about. Now,
I've got
making it interesting for them, you know, because a lot of the books for kids, so the high interest low vocab books won't quite cut it. You're gonna have to find some really good reading material that will be interesting to them, but they still need to be.
I'm going to cut you off. I'm sorry. So we have a lot of other questions. What I will ask Doug to do is to respond to them in writing, and so that we can send them off. The questions will probably be sent off next week, but you will get an email tomorrow with the PowerPoint and the recording. So thanks, Doug. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you, everyone.
So you'll be receiving an email from Travis Bonnell. He's the sales and marketing analyst tomorrow. We'll also provide some additional articles from Doug on literacy development. I think that might be useful. And we will be announcing our next webinar shortly, so stay tuned. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely day. Thanks. Bye.
Yes.